Today we're going to be talking about a very well researched paper done on floral fountain, also known as Slab Town. And in the title page here, you see this was done back in August 2nd of 1966, done for a class there at Wisconsin State University, Platteville. A folk history of Flora Fountain and Pleasant Ridge, also known as Slab Town and Darkey Ridge. And this was done for instructor Dr. Gamble, and this is by Mrs. Paul Kanoke. I hope I didn't say it wrong, but I'll spell the name. K-N-O-K-E was the person who did this paper. And there's very detailed record of all the research that was done, the sources that were used, and so it's really very elaborately done and goes way back to some of the immigrants that came, various churches mentioned, the schools, businesses, and things that existed at the time. Now there's something to keep in mind. We're still working on the pages themselves because it was done on a typewriter, might have been a manual typewriter by the looks. This is back in the 60s. We didn't have all these fancy equipments and computers that we have now and all stuff to work with. And so we need to kind of go through, fix a few letters here and there, because when you were typing by hand, especially for women and girls, their touch wasn't as heavy as it would have been like for me when I was on a manual typewriter. And even when electrics first came out, I used to think you looked at the electric typewriter and it almost typed by itself. But they got so they weren't quite so sensitive because they still had a heavier touch. And so that's something that we'll have to work on a little bit. Now, I want to mention about a few terms here that appear in the book, because we're talking about what we call now Afro-Americans, but there are many different terms used back in the past. Now, maybe they aren't the best terms, but we want to be historically accurate. You can't rewrite history. You have to tell it the way it is. And a lot of things are good. Just because different terms were used don't mean that they were used in a bad way. Because a lot of times the whites and the children and the Afro-American children sometimes were playing games together and different terms were used. Now I won't get into that because there's way too much to cover. But I want you to be aware of that. Also, when we talk about the Indians or American Indians, we're really talking, we should be saying Native Americans. Because some of them used to show up too in the early days there, certain places they like to come to. So we have to be careful there. We will be talking about rural one-room schools somewhat later. And be careful whenever you hear money mentioned. Sometimes it looks like in the past, well, that didn't cost very much, but you're talking not in our today's amount, but what it was back then. Back when it took a whole day or longer, maybe, to make $1. So $1 was worth a lot. So when you see a small figure back in those old days, that could be misleading. You have to think about what that means in today's terms. Next, I'm going to mention the divisions that the author has used here, just to give you an idea of different things that would be covered. This isn't in detail. There's lots of subdivisions under these headings, but just to give you an interesting understanding. There's the introduction. I'll be reading a little bit from that in just a few moments. Second part, location of two adjoining settlements. That's Flora Fountain, also Slab Town, Pleasant Ridge, sometimes referred to as Darky Ridge. There'll be the history of the early settlement of Flora area, history of the early settlement of Pleasant Ridge, back then in the writing here referred to as the Negro area. Then the history of the village site, and then there's different people that were used for references back about that. Then we have the industrial development, different businesses that existed, and that we can't get into all those, but they are covered, the different businesses that existed there. School development, we had Flora and also Pleasant Ridge schools. Church development in Flora and Pleasant Ridge. Recreation forums in Flora and Pleasant Ridge. And then the conclusion at the very end. Now we can only cover parts of these things, so we don't get too long here, but we want to get you interested because you don't always find something as detailed as this, really giving good background on what all was involved in those times. And sometimes we do have that for other communities, because at one time maybe you were on the road that was traveled at that time, but then bigger highways got made, and pretty soon places were bypassed. So that all makes a difference as time goes by. Now, this is a little bit from the introduction to the book. And this is quoting a few people, kind of interesting. Martha, have John get on old Ned and ride around the neighborhood. There aren't enough men to help raise the boarding house, and we'll need the women and children too, calls George Blackburn. Soon the ladies in their calico dresses arrive to help in the raising, and for some time people refer to Flora Fountain as over at Calico. Another name involved for a while. It is 1857, and probably the first social gathering to be held at Slab Town as we know it now. A bounteous basket picnic follows the day's activities, and everyone departs in high spirits. It's Sunday morning in June in Slab Town, 1860. A goodly crowd has gathered in the elm grove near the ford and the fountain by the bend in the Grant River. The picnic baskets are safely deposited near the mothers and partly hidden by their long, full skirts. The preacher, Adam John Jameson, mounts the pulpit and the meeting begins. After services comes the picnic, the games, and the inevitable ball game. Flora folk have always been baseball enthusiasts. All too soon it is time to get in the wagons and head home for chores or to walk up the slope and home to rest for a big day tomorrow at the sawmill, boarding house, blacksmith shop, carpenter shop, shoe store, or store. Now I'll be shifting here to another part, and this is referring to location of two adjacent settlements. Flora, often called Slab Town, is located about midway between Lancaster and Bloomington. It is just below the confluence of the Bloomington branch, what we now call Blake's Fork, and the Grant River. The views up and down the valley from the hill roads in all four directions out of Flora are beautiful. The bottomland at Flora is some of the best and most productive in Grant County. In the earliest days, the road through Flora was the main one between Lancaster and Bloomington. The present main road did not exist, and much traffic passed through Slab Town. Probably the greatest vision of splendor that Flora ever saw in the distance, what we thought was going to come, was at the time of the Flynn Railroad boom. Well, this is referring to a possible way of the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad to get to Bloomington. A high railroad bridge across the valley from bluff to bluff, a depot and stockyards were to have been Flora's portion, to say nothing of the era of growth and enterprise that would follow in its wake. But this, like former anticipations, failed to materialize. Side comment, of course, many different routes were surveyed over the years and surveyed, trying to figure out how to get to Bloomington with the least resistance from the land. What there would have been a problem for at Flora was a big trestle or bridge to go over the valley. Well, trestles cost a lot of money. And that was always a problem even going from the Fenimore direction. Same thing was always mentioned. Until 1870, the river was forded at Flora. At that time, a wooden bridge was built by Asa Schneed and another carpenter named Webster from B-Town. 6 years later, this bridge washed away and was replaced by another wooden one. Later, a steel one was erected, which went out in the Great Flood in the summer of 1903. So they had their floods back then, just as we've been having more recently all the time. They're always a possibility, a danger that could take place. After this, the abutments were raised and another bridge was put in. That pretty much completes there for our part one. We'll be doing a part two later on and giving us a little bit more on the place. But looking at the 1977 Grant County Atlas, you can see Flora Fountain there, shows up in big print. You can see some of the territory around it. Looks much more impressive, which it was at that time. And of course down in the corner there you can see what's representing B-Town itself. But at least we see that Flora Fountain got a lot of attention there in the map. And then there's another one here, which was much later, and where you see black dots really was read there by the Genealogical Society in Grant County, indicating where different rural one-room schools type were located. And there, of course, you can see approximately in the Flora Fountain area. And that will sort of complete our first part here. And we'll be looking at some other things here when we do part two.